In court, my husband leaned back in his chair, smiled at his lawyer, and said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "Without me, you are nothing." The words didn't sting the way he expected. They landed like something rehearsed, polished, confident, final. People glanced at me, waiting for a reaction. Tears. Anger. Collapse. I gave them none. For years, Ethan had spoken like that. Calm. Certain. As if my life were an extension of his signature. As if my silence meant agreement. He told the judge how he built everything we had, how I depended on him, how generous he'd been to someone like me. I sat there with my hands folded, listening, nodding once. What he didn't see was the envelope on the clerk's desk, sealed, labeled, heavy with numbers he had never asked about. When the judge reached for it, the room shifted, and in that moment, the man who said I was nothing was about to learn how wrong confidence can be when it's built on ignorance. My name is Stella, and for a long time, I thought love was something you proved by becoming easier to live with. I wasn't raised to take up space. I was raised to be polite, capable, and grateful. Grateful for opportunities, grateful for attention, grateful when someone chose me. So, when Ethan entered my life, confident and self-assured, I mistook his certainty for stability. He spoke as if the world had already confirmed his importance. His career plans were never if, only when. When he talked about the future, he talked about it like a man giving instructions, not sharing dreams. "You're intelligent," he told me early on, his tone calm, evaluative. "You just need structure. Direction." I took it as encouragement. I didn't hear the quiet assumption underneath that I lacked something he naturally possessed. After we married, the changes were subtle enough to feel reasonable. I stopped correcting him when he misrepresented my work to friends. I let him answer questions meant for me. When people joked that I was lucky to have married so well, I smiled and agreed, because disagreeing felt ungrateful. Ethan never told me to be smaller. He just rewarded me when I was. The more I adjusted, the smoother our life appeared from the outside, and the more invisible I became to myself. Slowly, without realizing when it started, I began to measure my value by how little friction I caused, by how well I fit into the life he claimed he had built for both of us. I told myself this was partnership. I told myself this was maturity. I didn't yet have the language to call it what it really was. Training. Ethan never needed to raise his voice to be in charge. That was the detail everyone missed. Control, in our marriage, didn't arrive as anger. It arrived as concern. It sounded thoughtful, reasonable, almost loving. And because of that, it took me years to recognize it for what it was. "Do you really need to work that late?" he'd ask, glancing at his phone. "You look exhausted." "I just worry about you." If I insisted, he would sigh, the way someone does when they feel inconvenienced by stubbornness. "I just don't want you burning yourself out for something that doesn't really matter." At first, I defended myself. I explained why my work was important, why it made me feel capable, alive. He listened, nodded, then gently corrected me. "Stella, ambition is good," he said once, pouring himself a drink. "But it has to be realistic. I already provide more than enough. You don't need to prove anything." What he meant was clear. Not to him. He took over the finances early in our marriage. It made sense, he said. He had more experience, a better understanding of risk. I told myself it was efficient, not controlling. Every purchase I made was questioned. Not forbidden, just examined. Why this brand? Did you really need that? Couldn't we have found a cheaper option? Meanwhile, his expenses were never discussed. They were investments, necessities, proof of success. When I brought up wanting more independence, he laughed softly, almost indulgently. "You're safe because of me," he said. "That's not a bad thing. Don't confuse comfort with capability." The words settled into me like a verdict. Slowly, my world grew smaller. Friends stopped calling after canceled plans and awkward dinners. Family visits became rare, always inconvenient. Ethan never told me to choose between him and them. He simply made it clear which choice was easier. And the most dangerous part? I started agreeing with him. I began to doubt my instincts, my decisions, my own sense of competence. Not because he ordered me to, but because he convinced me I didn't need them anymore. By the time I realized something was wrong, I had already learned how to live inside the boundaries he drew. The moment that changed everything didn't arrive with a fight or a dramatic revelation. It came on an ordinary Tuesday night, when I caught my reflection in the dark screen of my laptop and barely recognized the woman staring back. I looked. Muted. That realization scared me more than Ethan ever had. I didn't decide to leave him that night. I didn't even decide to confront him. What I decided was simpler and far more dangerous to the life he had designed for me. I decided to stop disappearing. The first step was small enough to feel harmless. I opened a separate bank account at a different branch across town. I deposited a modest amount, telling myself it was just for emergencies. Ethan didn't notice. He never checked the statements himself. He just assumed control meant awareness. Next, I started learning again. Quietly, carefully. Late at night, when Ethan was asleep or out at another work dinner, I took online courses, read industry reports, and relearned skills I had let rust. I used private browsing, cleared my history, and saved files to encrypted folders. It felt ridiculous at first, hiding knowledge like contraband, but the secrecy sharpened my focus. I wasn't chasing revenge. I was rebuilding competence. Soon, ideas began to form, real ones, practical ones. I sketched business models on scraps of paper and hid them inside old notebooks. I tested small projects under freelance names, watching the numbers respond to my decisions. Each correct choice gave me a quiet rush of confidence I hadn't felt in years. Ethan mistook my growing calm for submission. "You seem more relaxed lately," he said one evening, pleased. "See? You didn't need all that stress." I smiled and let him believe it. What he didn't see were the spreadsheets filling up on my laptop, the plans taking shape in the margins of my life, the version of me that was slowly, deliberately returning. By the time Ethan noticed I had changed, he assumed it was because of him. He never considered the possibility that I was preparing to survive without him. By the time the truth surfaced, I was no longer afraid of it. That surprised me. For years, I had lived with a low, constant anxiety, like walking through a house where something was always about to fall. I told myself it was stress, or marriage, or my own inadequacy. I never once considered that my body already knew what my mind was avoiding. The signs were small at first. Ethan coming home later than usual, his phone turning face down on the table. A new password, he said, was for work security. When I asked questions, he answered smoothly, almost lazily, as if he'd rehearsed the explanations long before I asked. I didn't accuse him. I watched. I started noticing patterns instead of stories. The same late nights every week, the same restaurant name appearing on receipts, the way his mood lifted after certain calls. I kept notes not out of jealousy but clarity. I needed facts, not emotions. The confirmation came on a Thursday evening. A message flashed briefly on his phone while he was in the shower. I only saw a preview. "Miss you already." That was all. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I felt something colder settle into place, a sharp, unmistakable certainty. By the time Ethan came back into the room, towel around his waist, smiling as if nothing existed between us, I had already accepted what that message meant. When I finally confronted him, I expected denial. What I didn't expect was indifference. "This doesn't have to be dramatic," he said, rubbing his temples. "It was never serious. Never serious." He spoke as if the betrayal were a scheduling issue, not a fracture. As if my hurt were an inconvenience he needed to manage. "I've given you a good life, Stella," he continued. "Don't ruin it over something that doesn't change anything." That was the moment the fog lifted. Not because he had cheated, but because he truly believed I had no leverage. No exit. No future beyond the one he allowed. I nodded. I stayed calm. I told him I needed time. And for the first time, that wasn't a lie. Because, while Ethan believed he had revealed the worst thing he could do to me, I understood something far more important. He had just shown me exactly how little he thought I was capable of surviving. And that made what came next possible. Ethan filed for divorce the following month. Not out of guilt. Out of confidence. He presented it the way he did everything else in our marriage, as a decision already finalized, a path already chosen. When he told me, his voice was calm, almost kind, like a manager explaining a company restructure. "This is the cleanest solution," he said. "I don't want this to turn ugly." What he meant was, "I don't want you to fight." He moved quickly. His attorney sent over the first settlement offer within days. It was framed as generous enough money to get back on my feet, temporary support, and a reminder of how difficult things could become if I chose to resist. "You'll be fine," Ethan told me when I questioned it. "I've made sure of that." I thanked him. That response unsettled him more than anger would have. Behind the scenes, I did something Ethan never imagined I would do on my own. I hired a lawyer. Her name was Rachel Morgan, and she didn't smile when I told her my story. She listened, took notes, asked questions Ethan had never thought to ask me. Then she said something that shifted the ground beneath my feet. "Let him underestimate you," Rachel said calmly. "Men like your husband make mistakes when they're certain they're in control." We didn't reject the settlement immediately. We asked for time, discovery, documentation. I let Ethan believe I was overwhelmed, unsure, hesitant. I played the role he expected, the quiet woman who needed guidance. Meanwhile, I documented everything. Every account, every transaction, every inconsistency. I organized files late at night, scanning records and backing them up in places Ethan didn't know existed. I watched as he grew impatient, as his emails became sharper, his offers more urgent. "You're dragging this out," he accused one evening. "You don't have the resources for a long fight." I looked at him and said nothing. Because the truth was, this wasn't a fight fueled by desperation. It was a strategy built on patience. Ethan believed the outcome was inevitable. That the system, the money, and the narrative were on his side. He had no idea that the war he thought he'd already won was only just beginning and that I was no longer playing defense. The courthouse smelled like polished wood and quiet judgment. I arrived early, dressed carefully, not to impress but not to disappear either. Neutral colors, clean lines, nothing that invited commentary. Ethan was already there when I walked in, standing beside his attorney, laughing softly as if this were a networking event instead of the formal dismantling of our marriage. When he saw me, his smile sharpened. "You look well," he said. "I'm glad. That tells me you're handling this maturely." I nodded and took my seat. The hearing began exactly the way Ethan expected it to. His attorney spoke first, laying out a story that sounded polished, practiced, and painfully familiar. Ethan was presented as the provider, the builder, the stabilizing force. I was described as supported, protected, dependent. When Ethan took the stand, he performed effortlessly. He talked about sacrifices, about patience, about how he had encouraged my interests while carrying the financial weight of our life. He spoke slowly, clearly, like a man explaining something obvious to people who simply needed time to understand. Then he looked at me. Not with anger, with certainty. "Without me," he said, his voice steady in the silent courtroom, "she would have nothing. I gave her stability, opportunity, a life." The words landed heavily, echoing in the space between us. I felt eyes turn toward me, waiting, watching, expecting something, shame, maybe, or fear. I didn't react. Because what Ethan didn't realize was that the moment he said those words out loud, he stopped being persuasive and started being reckless. He had put his belief into the record. He had defined the narrative so completely that there was no room left to retreat. When my attorney stood, she didn't interrupt him. She didn't challenge him yet. She simply said, "Your Honor, before we proceed further, we request that the court review the sealed financial disclosure prepared by Mrs. Hart." The clerk lifted the envelope from the desk. For the first time that morning, Ethan frowned. And for the first time in years, I knew something he didn't. The judge opened the envelope without ceremony. No dramatic pause. No warning. Just paper sliding free, the quiet sound of pages turning, and a shift in the room that was almost physical. I watched Ethan closely then, not the judge, not the lawyers. I watched the man who had spent years telling me I was nothing. At first, he looked bored, confident. He leaned back in his chair, one ankle resting on his knee, as if this were a formality delaying the inevitable. Then the judge's expression changed. Not shock, recognition. "For the record," she said, adjusting her glasses, "I will summarize the disclosed assets." My attorney remained still, silent. She had already done her work. The judge began with my business interests. Valuations, revenue streams, intellectual property, long-term contracts. Each figure landed with a soft thud, like something heavy being placed carefully on a table. Ethan straightened. When the judge moved on to investment accounts diversified, documented, independently managed, his confidence fractured. I saw it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his attorney leaned toward him and whispered too quickly. The final numbers were read clearly, evenly, without commentary. Total net worth. The courtroom was silent. Ethan's face drained of color. He stared at me as if I had spoken a language he didn't understand, as if the woman sitting across from him could not possibly be the same one he had dismissed, corrected, and minimized for years. His attorney stood abruptly. "Your Honor," he said, voice tight. "We were not made aware of these assets. Given that they were accumulated during the marriage, we request—" My attorney rose before he could finish. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "we direct the court's attention to Clause 12 of the prenuptial agreement, signed by both parties. Any business or investment established without financial contribution or support from the other spouse shall remain separate property." The judge reviewed the document. Slowly, she nodded. Ethan shook his head, once, as if refusing to accept reality. He turned toward me, his voice barely controlled. "You planned this." I met his eyes for the first time that day. "No," I said quietly. "I survived it." The judge cleared her throat and began issuing her ruling. I barely heard the words. I already knew the truth had landed exactly where it needed to. For the first time, Ethan understood something I had learned the hard way. Power doesn't belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the one who did the work when no one was watching. The ruling was delivered calmly, almost gently. The judge spoke about disclosure, about responsibility, about how the law protects facts, not assumptions. She explained that my business interests and investments, built independently and without my husband's support, would remain mine. She addressed Ethan's claims with precision, dismantling them not with emotion but with evidence. By the time she finished, the outcome was clear. Ethan didn't look at me as we stood to leave. His confidence, once so effortless, had collapsed inward, leaving only confusion behind. The man who had declared I was nothing no longer had the certainty to repeat it. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter. Not because I had won, but because I was no longer carrying the weight of being misunderstood by someone who never tried to see me. I hadn't outsmarted Ethan. I had simply stopped living inside the limits he set for me. In the weeks that followed, my life didn't transform overnight into something glamorous or loud. It became quiet. Intentionally so. I chose where I lived, how I worked, who I spoke to. For the first time in years, every decision belonged to me. What I learned stays with me now. That silence can be preparation, not weakness. That independence is built long before it's revealed. And that the law, when met with truth and patience, can be a powerful shield for those who are willing to protect themselves. If you are ever told that you are nothing without someone else, remember this. People who need to diminish you are often terrified of what you might become once you stop believing them. Sometimes the most powerful response isn't to argue. It's to build and let the truth speak when the time is right.